Alright, here we got some early cast iron small block Chevy heads, open chamber. And most people tend to think these suck, myself included. Over the years, anything with a big chamber wasn't worth fucking with. You just overlook that shit right away. Go for the 64cc chamber shit. It's easier to build compression, and they generally flowed better than later model shit. But these are 1973 993 casting. Come off like a 250 horse 350 out of like a Monte Carlo, Malibu, Impalas and shit. These heads here were used on a dirt track car that was rules limited. They were on a claimer engine back in the day. And one of the rules was you had to have open chamber cast iron GM heads, and you couldn't port them. So there was your bottleneck. I think 360 cubic inch was the limit on the engine size. So to run that class, you had to find you an old pair of open chamber GM heads. Try to find the best pair you could. So a lot of people started flow testing them and shit, comparing them, figured out what the good ones were and what the bad ones were. These were the good ones. These and the 487, 487X, 441, these 993s. That's about your best of your open chambered small block Chevy heads. They got the good ports. Your later ones, fucking ports would be all, the metal would come up here, deformed rectangle. These were a better runner. They flowed better than like your 882s and 601s and shit like that. Those wasn't worth a damn. These, the intake runners, flowed about what your old 461s, 462s, 291s, your old double hump heads. These had pretty much the same intake runner. The exhaust was also similar. They flowed pretty good for what they were. Of course, these heads come off a dirt track engine. You never leave well enough alone. So they got 202 160 valves put in them. They've been milled. Can't port them, but you could put bigger valves in them. They got a good valve job. Got a seat put in that exhaust there. The ports are a lot better than your later, like 882s and shit. these flowed about with them old double humps flowed, and then you put bigger valves in them. These have had a little bit of bowl porting, but not obviously, but you can tell they've been smoothed out a little bit down in there. So these probably flow in the 220s. So theoretically, you could build a 430, 440 horse engine using a pair of these fucking heads. Those chambers come out to about they started out as a 76 cc. I think they're about a 72 or 74. So you throw you like a fucking dish piston, you're gonna be about 8-to-1. Like a flat top, zero deck, you get around 9-to-1. And then like 100 tall dome, you get up about 10-to-1. And like what would be a 12.5-to-1 dome piston for a 350 get you up over 11-to-1 with these. So you can get the compression up in them, you're just gonna have to run a dome piston. These are good heavy castings. They're not the thin shit that came about 1975, 76. They're still pretty solid back in these years. You can tell the thick castings, like the whole fucking head in here is like raised up. The later ones, it was like all this was just smoothed, like leveled out. They took a bunch of metal out of them, and they fucked up the ports on them. And these are cut for screw-in studs. They're cut for 145 diameter valve springs. They're also cut for PC seals. Guides are cut down to run some big lift. These heads were ran with I think it was a 557, 570 something exhaust, solid flat tappet. There's a big solid lifter dirt track cam, oval track shit, like a 105 lobe separation. Ran with an old school Victor Jr. and a 750 double pumper. I believe it had about 11.5-to-1 compression. Zero deck them. Run 26 thick head gaskets, throw a dome in there, mill the heads. That compression will jump right on up. You cut for the big springs. You got your original spring pocket there, and then this is where it's opened up for the bigger spring. Put a shim in there, like a 30,000 shim. It brings that up to the level of this. And then run like 100 long valves. So they get some installed height. John Lingenfelter, back in the 80s, he built a lot of fucking engines that they sold, like crate engines and shit. And they'd use old iron heads. But these 993s were some of his favorite of the open chamber variety. These are way better than like the 882s and later shit. That old high nickel thing, there's something to that, because like high nickel blocks and heads and shit don't rust as quick as like iron that has less in it. These fucking heads been bare metal for like 2 years, and this is all the rust they got on them. I ain't touched these fucking things in a couple of years. Take some 80s cast iron heads and take them down to bare metal. Let them sit for a couple of years. They'll be rusty as a son of a bitch. These things ain't rusty at all. These heads would be good for, like, if you're building a low buck turbo engine. You want some good, thick, heavy castings, open chamber to keep the compression reasonable, so you can run on the street, pump gas, and actually be able to turn the boost up. But in my opinion, these 993s are about the best open chamber head they made. These and the 487s are about the only ones worth using. All the rest of them make good wheel chocks. I think these flowed like 212 CFM stock on the intake. I can't remember what the exhaust was, maybe 150. Don't quote me, but it wasn't nothing to write home about for damn sure. But you open them up for bigger valves and shit and do a good valve job on them, you can pick that up about 10 CFM easy. So these are somewhere in the 220s. And every CFM, allegedly, which it don't always go that way, but say 200 CFM is good for 400 horse, theoretically. So if you got 220, it'd be good for 440. Which they do. You look at NHRA stock eliminator engines. They're unported. I seen a 1974 350 Smog engine out of a Malibu, NHRA stock Malibu. And that thing made like 435 horse on a dyno. And it had stock heads, had stock type pistons. They were badass pistons, but the head was stock. You know, had to fit the rules. I mean, you can, stock engines, you can get away with some shit and get the compression jacked up and run a hell of a cam with 390 and 410 lift, like 270 at 50 duration. So those stock engines ain't really as stock as one might think. They're actually pretty fucking rowdy. But that was a 74 350, and the earlier ones, the 68, 69 350 stock engines, they're over 500 horse. So, like an NHRA stock LT1 350, well over 500 horse. They run 10s in the quarter. But these were on a dirt track car. Oh, fucking roundy round. But you could put these, not everybody needs 1,000 horse fucking engine, or not everybody needs or wants or can afford. Some people are just fine with a 300 to 400 horse engine for their old pickup truck they fuck around in or pull a trailer with, or just cruise. You want to throw together a good cheap engine that'll still melt the fucking tires off when you stand on it. Person could get by with a pair of these heads. Throw you some 100 tall fucking domes and good intake and a good cam and a 350, and you have a pretty decent street engine. Could be built pretty cheap. Just the thing about these motherfuckers is the machine work. The fucking machine work in these things will set you back about what, you could buy a new set of aluminum heads for the fucking machine work in these damn things. That's the problem with that shit now. But back in the day, you get these old timers that were cheap. Everything just used to be cheaper. Everybody wants $1 million fucking dollars for that shit now. Back in the day, you could take a pair of old heads to the machine shop, drop them off, spend a few $100, and have a pretty good pair of heads ready to go. Now that few $100 is like fucking 1,000 plus. So it's cost prohibitive in many applications. But if you got an old pair of these and you just want a mild engine, you ain't gotta go as far as, you ain't gotta cut the fucking spring seats out and the PC seals and all that shit. You can get by and you ain't gotta put the big fucking valves in them. You could use 194, 150 valves and throw a mild cam in there, Z28 valve springs, and come out pretty cheap. But these were run with a big solid flat tappet cam. It was turning 7,000 RPM. A Claimer engine. I think it had the claim on that class was like $1,500. Anybody could have bought the fucking engine. But they work pretty good for what they are. Of course, modern aftermarket shit is better. I'm well aware. I got a bunch of them. But for a guy on a budget, this old shit, them old fucking double humps and all that are getting kind of rare these days. But you can still find these. And people practically give them away because they are open chamber heads. But you can cut these things down about 30 thousandths and get them down about 70 cc. So there you go, open chamber heads.